Right, here we go. Unscripted, unedited, unfiltered. Why? Because within a year, this is about the only way you're going to be able to view genuine, authentic human content that's not being mediated by AI. It's getting that good, and pretty much it's going to flood every single medium. Thank you for watching. My name is Vincent, and this, as the title is attention is the very last thing you need. Now, if you're in the know around AI, you'll know this is in a parody of the very famous 2017 document or position paper, Attention is All You Need, which pretty much set up the standards or laid out the course of AI as we know it. The AI we have today. And so your content feed is no doubt unbelievably either filled with things created by AI or people talking about AI, mostly from a doomerish point of view, I should imagine. And I'm sure you're absolutely saturated with it all. But, so I've been thinking long, deep and often about AI. I've made it a full-time occupation since at least I wrote my first article warning about what was to come with AI 6 months before Attention is All You Need was published back in January 2017. And I tried to give a completely different perspective and a more honest observation of just how impactful AI will be, but not necessarily through the lens of contemporary society, of the way that we see the world. If I use the example, prior to the printing press, probably about 0.1% of the world's population would have understood a second or third abstracted concept of a financial instrument, paper-based money, bonds, stocks, shares. Prior to that, 99.9% of the world viewed money, finance in terms of coins, bullion or plate, what articles they had, candlesticks, etc., made of precious metals. Those would have been all they would have considered of as money. But pretty soon after the printing press, all of these kind of second and third degree abstractions of stocks and deeds, etc., all started to come in, and we just accept them. And so what we're trying to do at the moment, or what an awful lot of people try to do, is they foresee the AI of the future, which is pretty much like the present, but just thrown into the future. And that's not how it works out. In the same way as the removal of coinage as the main form of financial transactions, and then that itself then abstracted into the digital way that we use currency today. So we just have these developments that at the time of the invention of these things, people just really can't envisage it because it hasn't happened. I go into this in great detail about how AI is basically the next move on from the printing press, which itself was the move on from writing, which itself was the move on from manuscript, because these are cognologies, not just technologies, but these are huge, world-changing cognitive improvements in the way that we handle information. So all I do is I extract patterns and I look and see where these patterns have happened before. I then try to extrapolate them into the future and where they could happen again, and each time on a very different scale. And then of course with AI we're at the exponential scale where things are moving at such a pace, as no doubt you have realised. So today, attention is the last thing you need. And the reason I'm saying that is because, again, so much of the predictions about the impact AI is going to have is similar to projecting a world that's full of coins after the invention of the printing press. And in this case, it is attention, or to be more precise, audiences and audience capture. Now, the great James Burke, the futurist, and if you haven't seen his programs Connections, do watch them. They are incredible. Track them down on YouTube. But he offered in a coda to his second series, The Day the Universe Changed, he spoke about the printing press, and he said, Gutenberg threw us out of the village, but via digital we will return to the village. And what he meant by that was print and the printing press brought forth the concept of an author, of an authority on a specific book or on a specific subject. Prior to this, there were people who had written books, very, very few, but it was the ideas that these people encapsulated, that was what was being copied via manuscript and put into libraries. But the idea of being a full-time author, having authority over a written text, was unknown. And it was also completely unknown outside of those very specific strictures of religious scholarship or the philosophical small academia, the small amount of universities that were around at the time, that there was a possibility of you ever even thinking about making a living from writing a book, because books didn't exist, not as we know them anyhow, not as small portable things that are easy to carry around and could be mass produced at scale. And it was that mass production at scale that made books something that somebody could invest their time and effort and hope to recoup and make a living from. And through making that living, the book had to be publicized. It had to be published widely, and it had to have an audience, a literate audience, in order to consume these books. But prior to the printing press, there wasn't this idea of, I produce something purely for the sake of getting as many eyeballs as possible on it. So what James Burke was referring to was the need for us, or what happened with the printing press is we expanded massively outside of what was basically our Dunbar number. So if you know, the Dunbar number is roughly the amount of people that any one person can have genuine social contacts and interactions with meaningfully. So the examples that are often used are, it's the number of people that you know in your life that if you bumped into them in an airport, you would probably go and have a drink with them. Or another example, probably the amount of people you would lend your lawnmower to, or your sewing machine, or a piece of kit that you own that you would lend to in the expectation that they would look after it and you would get it back without them being such a stranger that you didn't know their motivations, etc. And that roughly tops out about 140 people, which is roughly the size of a small village, which is where the vast majority of people lived. Vast majority of people lived in that kind of groupings prior to the printing press. And for thousands, if not tens of thousands of years, that size of, it works out roughly 12 families. If you think of 12 people of an immediate family, brothers, sisters, aunts, uncles, grandparents, etc., cousins. So 12 times 12. So roughly between 140, 150 people. That is our top limit for how many people we as an individual can sort of keep in our heads and keep tags on, etc. Now, authorship, and then all of the developments that came after that, so from books to printing, newspapers, periodicals, magazines, and then eventually on to telegraph, and then the radio, and then television and film. All of these are now social media and influencers. Every single one of these relies on breaking and destroying the Dunbar number, and each one relies on more and more of an audience. And we classify audience now, audience participation, or the number of eyeballs, the number of likes, the number of endorsements, the number of comments, the number of upticks, the number of whatever, is how we as a society best measure success. How we sell things, how we advertise things to reach the maximum number of people possible. That's how we judge everything. It's almost our entire structure of society is built around that output of the printing press. Now, the printing press, in its stricture, one of its main strictures, was it and its offshoots of radio, television, film, and social media. Social media is different. This is where the change is coming, but is based on a very specific way of communicating, and that is, I broadcast, you listen. I post, you read. I make a film, you sit down and watch it. I write a book, you read it. It's a very one-way communication, because that is the confines of or that is one of the strictures of the printing press. I can print stuff at mass and I can make massive amounts of copies, but it's a one-way communication. Now, the father of information theory, Claude Shannon, one of the dictums of information is that genuine information, can only occur between equals. So the transmitter and the receiver both must be equal and capable of transmitting and receiving information. But that point where a printing press is very good at transmitting information, they're terrible at receiving information. So we built almost our entire society around the idea of information being transmitted in one direction and received by the masses. It was not an equal process. And if you look at the institutions that we now take for granted as being the gatekeepers of information, academia, newspapers, law, governments, bureaucracies, etc., they all work on a very similar basis. They transmit the information, we, the masses, receive the information. They gatekeep the information, or have done for the last 400 or 500 or 600 years, where they have acted as the arbiters of what information was filtered, was proven, was chosen to be worthy. So they acted as both the gatekeepers and the facilitators of this information, which was then transmitted down to the masses, down to the mass of the people. The newspapers do. They choose what to report. Academia, it chooses what is to go onto the curricula, what needs to be learnt. We built our entire society around that, everything, which is, I refer to it as the Printocene. The Printocene era, because it basically structured, it acted as the substrata which underlay how our entire society, modern society, has been founded. You read magazine, you look at treaties. Why do we, if you think of the height of the Printocene period, was just before the digital period, just before the move towards computers. Now, this always happens. There was more manuscripts published in the first 10 years after the printing press, actual handwritten manuscripts were brought out, than had been done in the previous 100 years. So you always have this crossover. So in the 1940s, you see that as the high point of when written contracts, when the solid nature of information in writing, United Nations treaties, peace deals, massive business deals, and all of the things that we put into, as we've called it, the modern, the nation state and the world order that came out of the ruins of World War II, are all based around these treaties and these articles and these declarations, etc. It was the high point of the written document. The civil rights groups and freedoms that have all been enacted have all been about having treaties, having things written into legislation and into law, because we treat print as solid, scarce and sacred. What do I mean by scarce? Well, again, we have to have, if you wanted to publish a book, you would have to first write it and then have it edited and then find a publisher, but also have an agent, and they would then send it to a printer. It was a laborious process. And so print was seen as being something that was relatively scarce. It was solid because you can always look at a piece of paper. How does that work? Well, think about it when you talk about what are your most trusted documents. Your passport, the deeds to your house, the actual physical deeds. They may be on record somewhere, but it's holding the deeds in your hand. We still see as a written contract that you have in your hand as being proof. If you look at having a marriage certificate, having a birth certificate, you can have them online, But having the actual physical copies for us who were born inside this Printocene era, this is still seen as being the most solid proof that something exists. That having it written down on a piece of official paper, that's a very solid. And sacred, we treat print. If I was to take a book from a library, if you saw somebody sitting in a library scribbling all over a book, you would have a revulsion to that. We see written work as being, because it has taken a laborious amount, because there is a lot of effort and gatekeeping and channeling for this information to get to you, we have seen it as having a sacred quality. The religious wars that came after the printing press were all based around this. The massive Protestant versus Catholic was the sacredness they were putting towards their texts, that nobody sat there and went, it's just a bit of paper. That wasn't going to be how it worked, okay? So, this is the difference with AI, or one of the massive things we're not taking into consideration. AI works by removing that barrier of a broadcast receive. It can both broadcast and receive. You can both broadcast and receive, but it also removes the necessity of those gatekeepers. AI's massive contribution, in the same way as manuscript handwriting massively changed with the print, with the invention of print, we are facing a similar but even more exponential change, because what AI is doing is it's making information no longer solid, sacred and scarce. It's doing the opposite. It's making it soft, suffuse and secular. Very smart. Hang on, isn't that clever? That took me ages to come up with these. Believe me, you have no idea how many words were tossed on the fire when I was coming up with these. It's soft. Look what you can do with AI already. You can turn any piece of information into a graph. You can turn it into a graphic. You can turn it into a flow diagram. You can play with it, manipulate it, shape it, change it, etc., etc. It's not fixed and solid onto a piece of paper anymore. Even in the same way as when digital first came around, we mirrored how the print had been, which is why documents on your screen look very similar to documents on a piece of paper. It's why you have a bin. It's why you have files and folders. They all replicate what came before, the office system that came before. But now, even in the last week, has been brand new ways of absolutely formatting text in ways that have made me spellbound, because it has finally broken free from that idea of text having to be produced in the same way it was produced in a book, which was originally in the same way a better version than how it was seen in manuscripts. Anyhow, so it is soft, it is suffuse, it is everywhere, it is permeating the culture in the same way that print permeates our culture. It's so permeable, it's so permanent, it's so embedded, we don't see it. We don't think when we walk into a doctor's surgery and there's signs all over the walls, some of them about health and safety, some of them saying please wash your hands, then there's some leaflets on the wall, then there's some leaflets on the reception desk, then they come and get your records, and then there's a few magazines you could read from all over the place, probably about 10 or 15 years old, then there's some colouring books or some books for the children to read, some story books, and then there's other posters on the wall, and then you'll go into the doctor's and he'll get your notes and he's got some medical books, etc. Books are everywhere. This screen that you're looking at right now, I have a passion for books, absolutely passion, but I understand where we're going with this, in that just as print suffuses every element of our lives, AI is suffusive in the same way, but even more so. These books are fixed text. They're lovely, they're amazing. Every part of me has emerged from my indulgence of books, every part of my intellectual journey. But they are still solid. Whereas AI, all those books, they can do the one thing that many an author has mused upon. They can talk to one another. And that is a massive, massive change. So information goes from being scarce to being suffusive. It's everywhere. And it will be in everything. And we have to get used to it in the same way. It's hard for us to give up the thing that we have loved for so long, but it's going to happen. So we have to learn to adapt to this new world. And it's no longer sacred. And in that respect, And this is the hard part that people really struggle with. We have built our society around this idea of there being gatekeepers of information, the experts, the professionals, the people who knew what information was good for us and fed it to us in amounts that they felt that we were worthy of absorbing. Again, AI has no innate respect for these, in the same way as the printing press had no innate respect for the church and for the kings and emperors that came before it. Because it doesn't need those to be the facilitators. They need to be something different, but they don't need to be the people, or they don't need to be the layer which is then offering information downwards in this one-way thing. Because information can now go both ways. It can feed back constantly between transmitter and receiver. And the information can be moulded and changed. The message is infinitely malleable now, so it doesn't have to be one message which is broadcast in the same way to everybody. It can be individualized, tailorized, personalized, handcrafted, batch cooked, small batch cooked, just for individual targeted audiences. It doesn't need to be one message is then distributed to everybody. It can be messages are distributed to everybody. And that is a massive, unbelievable change. Hence why most of the institutions are treating AI with the same way that the church treated the printing press. Now, again, something very not genuinely known by the public. Two things that are not genuinely known by the public. One, the Vatican first embraced the printing press. They actually set up its printing press, which had a very short lifespan when they realised that all the things they were capable of doing with the printing press, making copies of scriptures, etc., could also be done by people who were against the church and could equally produce massive amounts. So the church switched from being an early adopter and advocate of print to being a massive, the print is the devil's work, or the printing press is the devil's work. Which you could see from the church's point of view, it was, because they were no longer the holders of the sacred texts. They could no longer handle, or they could no longer be in charge of the flow of information to the degree that they wanted it. They didn't want people reading their own Bibles because they might start making their own opinions and having their own thoughts. Hence you had the massive backlash against why people didn't like Bibles and other texts being translated away from Latin. Latin had been the language of the ruling classes, the people who had facilitated the gatekeeping of information. It was a secret information, very much like coders and developers are now losing their Latin with the way that AI can do. When printing press started, the likes of Caxton, etc., and Winking de Word started to produce books in vernacular language, in the language that people spoke. So this was a massive step change. The other big step change, literacy. About 1%, maybe between 1 and 5% of the world could actually read and write, because there just wasn't that much to read and write. But we all had to learn to be literate. We had to learn this new strange abstraction of being able to look at marks on a piece of paper and recognise what they were and form them, and all the wonderful wonders of writing and reading that have come with it. We're going to have to do the same, but in a new form. I call it ludicity, something else in it, but it's alongside literacy. When you hear somebody say, oh, we need to become AI literate, that's like saying we need to become manuscriptly book printers. Doesn't make sense. You're clashing two brand new things. The new literacy is ludicity, a way of being playful and engaging with AI without fear, but with the perpetual sense of wonder that children have. Because what it can do can blow an entire sock shop, blow them off. It is unbelievable. But anyhow, right, so the secularity, so those three things have changed. It's no longer those things. Information itself. Now, okay, let's quickly define information. So Claude Shannon, again, father of information theory, of whom Claude is named after. The information, there's lots of formula and lots of stuff I could show you, and I could have an academic conversation, probably not to explain a lot of the algebra behind it, but basically it is this. Information can best be defined as the amount of unpredictability, the novelty, the unexpectedness in a message. The more unexpected a message, the more information it contains. If I say 1 1 1 1 1 1 1 1 1 1 1 1 1 recurring, That's a message with very little unexpectedness or novelty in it. It's not a message with a lot of information. If I said to you, oh Christ, look behind you, aliens have just landed, that's got a lot of unexpectedness, short amount of message, lots of unexpectedness. That's a high information content message. AI is fantastic at producing unexpectedness and novelty. Just as the printing press, that's why it was so successful. It was able of producing lots and lots of surprise, lots and lots of novelty. Ditto writing before that, and language was the first exploration of how we were able to express novelty and previously unknown things. We were able to express surprise and information, right? Unexpectedness. Christ, there's a lion over there. There's some wheat out there. There's some lovely berries over there. Don't touch the red ones. This is all information that you can then communicate. So, and AI is doing it exponentially on an unbelievable level. But the big key point I want to come back to is audiences. We don't need audiences for AI to work. This is hard. It's hard for us. It's like me trying to explain a financial instrument to you who've only lived in a world of coins and gold. Okay? That's the kind of abstraction we all need to get our heads around. The audiences become less and less needed. Now, they may be for entertaining purposes, but the need to amass an audience is not part of AI's success. It doesn't need to have massive, as long as they can all communicate with one another. As long as the transmission and the receiving can be done at individual levels, be they individual agents and the AIs, or be it us as individuals being able to communicate with one another. We don't no longer need that system that we have where influencers or people are chasing ratings and people are chasing, look how many likes I've got, look how many followers I've got, look how many subscribers. Every single time somebody says like and subscribe, they are buying into this system where everything as a unit of value is how many eyeballs we've communicated with. That is a system 600 years old, worked well. Now it's actually a drawback to our future in terms of the optimistic growth of humanity, when we can get rid of this curse of fame and celebrity and the need to stand out amongst all the others, where we can return to a much more humane, compassionate, and also usable, a much more utility based of being able to care for the groups that are closest to us and being able to work within our own capacities of that village size and no longer needing to stroke our egos to perpetually feed our, if the world doesn't look at me, look at the fear of missing out if people aren't subscribing to me. Yes, I appreciate the terrible irony of me doing this on a YouTube video, but how else do I get the message out? I have to work somewhere within the system in order to bring the system down, or at least to tell the system it's in the last chance saloon. Now, will this happen overnight? No. Will it be a generational thing? Probably. But it's enough to know that we are inside an antiquated system. And that antiquated system, AI is showing it up for it creaking around the edges, which is why one of the reasons you get so much doomerism amongst those for whom audiences and eyeballs and having as many impressions as possible is so important. It's the core of their being. It's the absolute, it's their raison d'etre. And in the same way as if you were a medieval monk, so if you're a medieval monk and you were working in a scriptorium, handwriting manuscripts, that made you you were in the 1%, what we now refer to as the 1%, right? You could read and write. That put you already above it. You were inside an abbey or a monastery which was well provisioned, which was going to be warm during the winter because you needed to be able to write those things. You were going to be looked after. Your health was going to be okay. You probably had access to wine, Trappist beer. You had maids, you had servants, etc. And you were doing God's work. You were doing something which had purpose. You were doing a thing which made you feel good when you did it every day. Now, 99% of your peers did not have life like that. 99% of your peers, including most of your own family, would have worked outdoors in all kinds of weather, would have done roles which were much more close, or much closer to persistence level. Okay? I'll give you something to look at. Hey, come here. Come here. Just so you can have a little bit of a break, you can look at my floof for a couple of seconds. Right, so you're a monk. You are writing every day. Everybody else is out in the fields doing back-breaking, monotonous, boring, tenuous work. And they're doing it in all kinds of weather, and they don't have the social support and structure that you have. Now, how are you going to feel about printing press? Not from a spiritual, I mean, you may feel like this is taking away God's purpose, but from a personal, individual level, you've gone from being a 1% of society, and suddenly this thing is threatening all of it. That's one of the reasons why the church had such a massive blowback against the printing press, as much as it would be able to quote scripture and tell the world how terrible the printing press was. It was terrible for them, really terrible for them. And so that did inform, and we're having the same thing. The massive amount of blowback that you're receiving, or you often hear about AI, you have to be able to strip out what is a genuine concern for humanity's welfare, and what is actually that individual's concern for their own welfare, their own status, their own prestige. Because they need those eyeballs. If it bleeds, it leads. If you're not scared, we're not doing your job. We're not doing our job. These were the kind of things that print was happy to say, that the press was happy to say. So it's all changing and it's all in flux. But like the printing press, I still ground on every day that the benefits and the positives of AI will far outstrip the negatives for the mass of humans. If we get our butt in gear and start seeing it with the big scope and start thinking big, because we've never had an opportunity to think this big, have we? Right, this is Flo, by the way. Okay, she's probably as bored as you. I've now talked for 32 minutes without pause, without break, without edits. But as I said, I think more and more AI content is going to look slicker, and you're going to have it harder and harder time being able to distinguish between what is real and what isn't. And you'll be able to know that I may waffle on and bore the hind legs off a dozen donkeys, but it's true, it's authentic, it's meaningful, and hopefully there's a lot of information content in there. Surprise, unexpectedness. I try and practice what I preach, see? Thanks for watching.